Yes, so, let's go back one. Right, that's me, Donal McBreen. I'm a programmer at 37 Signals. And so, yeah, Kamal 2 is the tool we're currently using to deploy Hey. So I'm going to talk a little bit just about Kamal in general, how it works, and then more specifically about what we've added for Kamal 2. So we sort of had the history already, so we'll go through this. I won't take too long. But where we were at the start was we were running a bunch of applications in AWS on their managed Kubernetes service, EKS, and we wanted to bring them in-house and run them on our own hardware. So we needed a way to run them. So one option would be to start using Kubernetes locally, but we looked at that and we didn't really fancy it. We were like, that looks quite tricky. We were looking at, we already had Basecamp, our biggest application, had always run on our own hardware, and we were just using Capistrano to deploy it. And when we looked at what we were doing in AWS, it was like, well, we don't really like this Kubernetes part, that looks a bit tricky, and we don't really need it, but this Docker bit looks great because we won't need to like artisanally manage our servers anymore to make sure we can, compile the latest Ruby and make sure all the gems install correctly. So we're like, well, we do like the Docker part. So what we decided we needed was Capistrano for containers. So if you don't know what Capistrano is, so in the days before Capistrano, you would deploy your applications by running some script you'd made up or SSHing into a server and just typing some random commands and hope that it worked. And Capistrano, which was originally built by James Buck, who's actually talking right now in the other room, was a way to make this simpler. So the idea was you would SSH, you'd have Capistrano would SSH to your servers for you and have a bunch of recipes that it would run that would deploy your app, and you'd have a repeatable build. And that was what we decided we needed. So Kamal is kind of a modern take on Capistrano, but designed to run with Docker. It's a Ruby gem built on top of SSHKit. So SSHKit is a library extracted from Capistrano, and that helps you, run commands over SSH concurrently and wait for them all to return, and just makes that really easy to do. And then the idea is you've just got some Linux servers running Docker or about to run Docker that you want to deploy to. Okay, so these were the three kind of big goals we had. First was that it would be zero downtime. So if you do a very naive version of just running Docker, you're going to have your application, you'll boot it up, sort of sit there on port 80, and then you've got a new version of the application. And what you need to do so that it can sit on port 80 is take the first one down and bring the other one up, and you've got a big gap there where you're going to be serving error pages. So we wanted to avoid that. The second thing was that it would be an imperative tool. And what this means is that we're going to run a command, and then we're going to wait. And when the command is finished, we're done. There's nothing else going on. So something like Kubernetes is more declarative. And I think the difference between the two is imperative means I insist, and declarative means I suggest. So with this, we're saying I insist you deploy, and you tell me whether you've deployed or not. And once the command's over, we're done. And then if we're going to wait for you, well, to complete, we need to be as fast as possible. So we're going to be deploying Docker images, so you've got to build them and move them around. So if that takes a long time, well, that's going to take a long time. But we wanted Kamal to be as fast as possible and avoid adding any extra overhead if possible. Okay, so the prerequisites, if you want to run Kamal on an app, so you'll need an app with a Docker file so you can build your Docker image. Now, it doesn't have to be Rails, it can be any kind of web app that you can package up as a Docker image. As David said earlier, you do need a Docker registry right now, and we have some ideas on how to get rid of that part because it's really, really annoying, but you have to live with that for now. And finally, you need a bunch of servers that you have SSH access to. Okay. So, and then if we want to install, well, with Rails 8, it will come installed already, unless you add the skip Kamal command option to the command. Otherwise, if you want to try it out on an existing application, you can install the gem, or you can put it in your bundle. So you do that, and then run Kamal init, which will create a bunch of files. So the main one here being config deploy.yaml. So we saw that earlier, but this is kind of the minimal version you need. So servers you're deploying to, details on your registry, and what architecture you want to build for. Okay, so here's our really simple looking infrastructure. We've got a host we're deploying from. That could be your laptop, could be a special host to use somewhere for deploying from, and a host we want to deploy to. And we're going to talk over SSH. You might have multiple hosts, that's fine. It'll do all the work to deploy in parallel if that's the case, though you will need your own load balancer somewhere to balance things out over those hosts. And we'll go through, we'll just use one host here. So we've got our deployment host, we've got our application host, and we've got our Docker registry for now anyway. And what we do is we run Kamal setup. When you run this, it's going to spit out this kind of output, which is kind of the standard SSH kit output. And it's quite handy because you can do a deployment and then just inspect that, and it will just tell you, here are the commands that Kamal does. So if you're like, what is it doing? You just run a deployment and then just go and start digging in those logs, and you can see exactly what's there. It's just the heritage from Capistrano, which is really handy. Okay, so when we run Kamal setup, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to check on the application host as to whether Docker's installed. If it's not, it'll try and install it. If it can't, well, you'll have to sort that out yourself manually. But otherwise, we'll get Docker installed on there, and then we'll do a Docker build on our deployment host. And that's going to build our application image on our host. And we'll push it, so do a Docker push. And then we will SSH over to our application host and do a Docker pull. So now we have our container sitting on our application host. Okay, so the next part's the deployment phase, and we'll zoom into the application host for that bit. So we've got our commands coming in over SSH from our deployment host. And we've got Docker installed here. We've just copied our image on. And the first thing we're going to do is boot a proxy. So this is, in Kamal 2, is going to be an instance of Kamal Proxy, which is the new proxy we've built. And my colleague Kevin is giving a talk on that after this. So if you're interested in knowing more, come along to that. But how we use it is we then boot up our application container, and then we tell the proxy, send the traffic through to that container. So now we're done. We're serving requests are coming in. The proxy is forwarding them to our application. Okay, so the next phase is I want to deploy a second version of applications. You've made your changes, you've committed them, and you want to do that, so you're going to run Kamal deploy. So Kamal setup is kind of just the initial setup and then a deployment, and then this one is just that sort of second phase, the kind of deployment part. So to start with, it's going to do that kind of dance of building the image and pushing it and then pulling it. So we've now got the second version of our application sitting on our application host. And this is where we left things off after our last deployment. So we'll just boot up a container running the second version of the application, and then we'll tell Kamal Proxy, please send the traffic over there. And we're done. So that's a very sort of the simple version of how it works. Now, there's more to it. There's things like, if you want to have, if you've got job servers where you don't need a proxy, it'll handle those, and you can configure all that separately. Okay. Oh, yeah. And then we can now turn off the old container because we're done. So one interesting part in this that I thought it would be worth discussing is what we call asset bridging. So if you have the naive version of the deployment, kind of as I described there, you have a problem as the new version is going out, especially if you're running on multiple application hosts and they're all deploying at a slightly different rate. You've got your new containers floating around, you've got your old containers floating around, and you have, so say you've got a build and you've changed your CSS. So now the fingerprint on the file has changed and you've got this new asset that you want that sits on your new containers and this old asset sitting on your old containers, but you have no guarantee about which container the requests are going to come to. So what are you going to get as you deploy? You're going to get 404s, you're going to get a few random unstyled pages, and if people are watching carefully, they can tell when you're deploying, which is not what we want. We want that to be zero time, downtime, and invisible. Okay, so this is a common problem, and like loads of Rails apps have this step beforehand where you'll like take your assets and copy them up to an S3 bucket or something and like have some separate asset host to make sure that they're there. But we wanted to make it so if you're using Kamal, you just don't have to worry about this. So if you go and create a new Rails 8 app and look in the config there, you'll find this line, asset path, Rails, public assets. So we're telling Kamal where in our Docker image it can find the assets. And what we'll do with that information is that we will boot up our application image. But we're going to change the entry point and just set it to sleep, so it just boots up and does nothing and just sits there hanging around waiting. And then we copy the assets out into a folder on the application host. So outside Docker in a separate folder. And now we've got those assets, we can stop our container. So we've got those assets, and what we're going to do is, well, the last time we deployed, we did the same thing. So we have the assets from the last deploy lying around as well. So we'll take the new assets and the old assets, copy them into a combined asset folder, and then we've got a folder containing all the assets. When I came up with this idea, I got this far, and I was like, now I don't know what to do with them. And luckily, my colleague Jeremy had what now seems very obvious point of what you should do with them, which is just map that folder back over Rails public assets when you actually boot your container. So when you boot up the new version of your application, Rails public assets contains the old assets and the new assets, so you don't care which container it hits. And you've still got the problem with your old containers, but you can fix that because you already had a folder mapped in for those. So before you boot up this new one, you copy those new assets back into that folder, and it can also serve both versions of your assets. So you get no 404s. You don't need to mess around with like trying to seed a CDN or hoping that like you'll just get hits from your CDN. I'm not saying you don't need a CDN. You might need a CDN, but you don't need it for this. And you don't need to like set up these special asset hosts to deal with this. So yeah, that's asset bridging. Okay, so now just to say, yes, it is releasing today. No, it has not released yet. I'm not as brave as Rosa releasing the thing and then doing a talk. I decided it would be better to do it the other way around. So the main thing that means is the documentation is not up to date. So if you've gone to look at the documentation, it's not got the information for the new version, but it will be there later today. Okay, so what's new? Well, the biggest thing is that we're changing the proxy we're using. So in Kamal 1, we used to use traffic as this proxy that we use to switch between containers. And so traffic it's an open source application proxy, and it's designed to kind of configure itself automatically and dynamically. And so how we would use it is it has a Docker provider, and when you boot up your container, if you put some labels on it, it will notice those labels and start sending traffic through to your container based on the labels. So that's what we were using. But there was kind of problems with this. It just became obvious the more we were trying to make all the, get rid of all the little edge cases and make sure that deployments went smoothly without dropping anything. And the main one is there's this kind of declarative imperative mismatch. With Kamal, we're saying, I want to call this command and I want this thing to happen. We're insisting, we're not suggesting, but traffic only takes suggestions. So you have to boot up the container with the labels, and then you have to start polling and waiting for it to notice the labels, and then suddenly it looks like, okay, it's picked it up, and actually I think we just had a bit where we go, and now we'll wait 3 seconds and assume it's got round to it. And that's just not great. It's not a great match. And the biggest problem we found was it was really difficult to drain requests because container labels are immutable. So you can boot up your container and say, send traffic to this container, But you can't get rid of those labels. It's just going to keep sending the requests to the container until the container goes away. So you get this problem as you're trying to stop it. Before you stop it, you want to say, don't send any more requests. Let's finish up the requests that are there, and then we'll stop. We couldn't do that with traffic, really. We had to resort to like really horrible hacks where we started messing with the health check and deleting files, so the health check would fail, and traffic would go, oh, better not send any requests to this container. So it wasn't great. And the third thing is, like, it was hard to understand what was going on when things went wrong. And this isn't traffic's fault. This is just you're getting errors in traffic's language. And traffic is a general purpose proxy, and it's got its kind of all these kind of quite, it's got these different concepts that allow you to do all kinds of things, but we just wanted it to do one thing. So you get these errors about entry points and routers and services, and it's just like, well, how does that connect to what I was trying to do? So we figured, yes, that this is not really working. And what we decided was we would build our own proxy to replace traffic, and this proxy was built with Kamal exactly in mind. So it's zero-ish config. Basically what we're saying there is one of the things we want to do is be able to run multiple applications. So if you have boot time configuration, then you can't vary it between the applications. So we have as little config as possible when you boot the proxy, and there's this kind of one-to-one command mapping. So when we want to deploy, you type Kamal deploy goes to the proxy, says deploy, the proxy deploys, says I've done it, we say yes, we've done it, and everything is just nice and streamlined, everything maps up, it's quick because you're not polling and waiting, and that's kind of one of the reasons we built it. And as I said, Kevin's going to talk a lot more, and there's some really cool features that we're planning to introduce into Kamal he's going to show later on. Okay, so one of the things we wanted to be able to do this, so when we built the first version of Kamal, it was really designed specifically for our use case in mind, which was you've got an application, you've already got a load balancer, you've got lots and lots of hosts that you're deploying to for this one application. But a lot of people who are using Kamal had a different kind of setup where you've sort of brand new app, you just want to run it on a single server, or you don't even want to, you've got 6 different apps and you don't need 6 different servers, or you don't want to mess around with creating lots of VMs, you just like to run them all on that one single host. So we built in support for these. We kind of saw this earlier in David's keynote, but you just configure the host and say SSL true, and that should, it'll go and do the let's encryption dance. So what you need here for this to work is that foo.example.com points directly to this server, and that port 443 is open on that server, and then the proxy will just automatically do all the rest for you. You just deploy, it should just work. And then multiple app support, we saw this again. You can just set the 2 proxies in each app's configuration. They can deploy to the same server, and you will end up with a situation that looks a bit like this. So we've got a proxy here, and we've got 2 separate applications, and it's using host-based routing to send the correct requests to each container. And now we can go and do our deployments that we saw earlier and deploy each container independently at the same time. It'll do that dance of switching one version and the other version out for us, and it should just work. The thing was that, traffic, one of the things about traffic was that it was very, very flexible, and we allowed you to add all kinds of, any labels you wanted to. So people have worked out how to do these things in traffic 1, but it was like, that was just people's ingenuity. We had not designed it to do that, and there were certain things that just didn't map well, so we've kind of gone back and tried to make sure that it's specifically designed so that these things just should work. Okay, so next. Right, so if you haven't used Kamal at all, this will be meaningless. If you have, you've probably struggled with these commands, wondering when am I supposed to run these, what do they do, and what's going on. So these are the commands we used for handling secrets. So we would store secrets in the .env file in the root of your application, and use the Kamal env5 was a command to build that from a template, and then push would then push them to the servers, and they had a different life cycle to the rest of the commands, and you had to remember which things you were supposed to run when, and it was all very complicated. And we found it very confusing, so if you found it very confusing, you were not alone. So what we wanted to do was, just simplify this. So we're using the ruby.env gem, so that's D-O-T-E-N-V, and it has support built in for variable and command substitution. So we thought we'll just lean on that. So now, here's what our secrets will look like, and this is what you should get in the default Rails 8 app. We've moved them. They used to be in the .env file, but that was like, it clashed with things like foreman. So we've moved them into a separate file, and we're using the interpolation to load these at kind of runtime. So when you run your command, we will pull these in at that point. So we don't need templates that build other files. We don't need to store your secrets on disk anywhere. We can just run it like this. So what's happening in that first line is it's just reading the registry password in from the environment, which does mean you have to set it up in your environment, which is annoying, but we're hoping to get rid of the registry altogether. So if we do that, then that problem goes away. And then the second command is using, the second line, we're using command substitution. So we're going to read the configuration file directly from a config master key, and that will just go into Rails master key again at runtime. Okay, so that sort of made life a bit easier. We don't need to store the secrets, as I said, on the file system. You can commit this file into your source control. You can just put your passwords directly in here. If you do, take it out of source control. But yeah, it should just work. But there's one flaw here in what I'm saying, which is I'm saying they're not on disk. But actually, if you look, yes, they are on disk. They're just in a different file. So if you start a new Rails app and you have your master key sitting in config master.key, you should probably put it somewhere a bit safer as soon as possible. So we've also added some secret helpers to kind of aid doing this. So this is kind of looks more like the version that we have running in Hey. So what we've done is we've added a couple of commands into Kamal. And this first one, Kamal secrets fetch, we've got a bunch of different adapters. So there's one for 1Password, LastPass, and Bitwarden at the moment, but we can add more as they go. We use 1Password, so probably that one is good. The other ones may have slightly rougher edges, but we'll get there with those. And we call this Kamal secrets fetch command, and that is going to go and manage getting the secrets from our password manager for us. So it's going to check, are you logged in? And if you're not logged in, it's going to ask you for your password or let you, you put your fingerprint in and authenticate with your password manager. And then as efficiently as possible, it's going to extract your passwords from your password manager. So in the case of 1Password, this means instead of having to run separate commands for every password, if you store them all in one item, you can grab them all in one go, which can be much more efficient. So that's the first part. And because we've got them all in one go, we then need a way to separate them out into the different variables. So we're going to store them under secrets, and then we'll run Kamal secrets extract, which honestly is just a glorified version of JQ, but you're definitely going to have Kamal installed because you're using Kamal, and you may not have or want to make sure that you've got JQ installed. So that will then pull those out and store them in there. So those are the secret helpers. Okay, so next we've got, so this, David kind of showed this a bit earlier, but this is the command you can run to open a Rails console, and you can do this right now in Kamal 1. So app exec is a Kamal command that will either boot up a new container running your latest application image or exec into an existing container and run the command you supply. So you can just pass Rails console, and there you go. You've got a running Rails console in production. But the problem is that it might be, this is a bit of a mouthful. They're also you might have very specific requirements. You might want the people always open the console on a specific host. So you can pass a host parameter here, you can pass -h, the host you want people to open the console, but you want everyone to get the same thing. So that's where aliases come in, which is shown so earlier, but here's how they look in the config. So you can just set an alias, and you can say, right, here's a console, and when you type console, it means this command here. And Rails, I think, will ship with console for opening a console, shell for opening a bash shell, and logs for just tailing logs on one of your servers. So yeah, so that's the aliases, and that's how it works. Then you can just run Kamal console. So if you've deployed with Kamal, that should be enough out of the box with Rails 8 to get yourself a console that's up and running. Okay, so yeah, just to say in conclusion, so Kamal 1, that was really, we built that with our specific use case in mind, but with Kamal 2, what we were really looking at was, say, you know, you're just typing Rails new, you're using Rails 8, with Kamal 2, say you've just bought a domain and you've got like a $6 a month, like DigitalOcean droplet or something, and you just want to go as quickly as possible from Rails new to it just running on HTTPS. And we saw from David's demo that you can do that really, really quickly. So that's kind of all the steps we've been doing here to try and make that process as smooth as possible. So one other thing I'll just say about Kamal 2 is, yes, it's not been released yet, as I said before. It will be released later today. Kevin is going to help me with that, because he's sort of dealing with Kamal Proxy, so we'll wait until after he's talked as well, and then we should be ready to go. And yeah, there'll be some updates to the documentation at that point, and yeah, it's really good to know what you think. Okay, and I'll just leave you with some links here. That is the currently Kamal 1 documentation site, soon to be Kamal 2. These are the repos for Kamal itself, the gem, and then for Kamal Proxy, the Go proxy. And that's me. Thank you very much.